I'm here with Daniela Volker, director of the documentary film The Commandant Shadow. Daniela, thank you. I watched your film. I thought it was incredibly powerful. I'm Jewish. I grew up learning about the Holocaust at a very young age, as most Jewish people did. I've actually visited several concentration camps. I used to live in Israel, and what I found interesting about your film is that it showed me a new perspective, something that I'm not used to seeing typically. Can you talk a little bit about your film?
I thought it was interesting to include the perpetrators because very often, quite rightly, we concentrate on the survivor's story because there are fewer and fewer of them. And I was in fact contacted by, through a friend, by the daughter of Anita Laskewalski. She's an Auschwitz survivor. And she was interested in making a film about her life as the daughter of a Holocaust survivor and transgenerational trauma. So I started to look into the subject, and I came across Hus, who was obviously the camp commandant. Then I found out not only had this man written his autobiography, he'd also had a son and a daughter who were alive, and another one, but she was a baby and actually very ill. So he had two children alive who still remembered, and a grandson who was the same age as Maya, Anita's daughter, so the Holocaust survivor's daughter. So in a way, that's how it all came together. And I've always been, as a filmmaker, interested anyway in looking at one subject from two sides. I mean, in the case of the Holocaust, there would be no victims or no survivors without the perpetrators. So it's sort of the other side of the coin, if you like.
And then speaking of portraying the perpetrators of the film, you made an interesting decision in The Commandant's Shadow to basically the film is narrated by Rudolf Haas. And I was hoping you could expand a little bit on your decision to do that for the film.
So I decided to have the voice of the commandant. It's not so much a narration as I would say the narrative spine of the film, because he wrote down his testimony, which is really sort of open and unflinching. He describes things which are so horrific, which he came up with and then implemented and then witnessed, because he says he had to be everywhere himself as he was demanding of those he was commanding. So in a way, I think it's the ultimate evidence really of what happened, and you have to remember Rudolf Hess, he was not just the perpetrator, he was the prime witness as well. He was in a very kind of unique position. So I thought, especially with the fact that people I think Holocaust denial these days tends to be more like it wasn't that bad, it can't have been that bad. Rudolf Hess actually proves it really was as bad as we think, and even worse, actually. His own son, whom I filmed for the first time reading his father's memoirs, he said, this is unbelievable, unimaginable even.
You spoke to Rudolf Haas's daughter as well, and I was wondering, were you expecting a different answer from her? So when you conduct interviews like this, is there a way you expect it to go, and you have to kind of make it up in the moment where to, if it doesn't go your way, or what happened with that, and was there an expectation?
Well, I've been negotiating this bit of filming her interview and her reunion with her brother, whom she hadn't seen for 55 years for various complicated family reasons, actually not linked to the Holocaust. But I hadn't been negotiating with Pippi for 2 years, so I knew what she thought. What's always a surprise is when people actually say it when you're filming them, because some of what she says is pretty, incredible. So I kept trying to sort of, in a way, give her a chance just in case, because she was very old, very ill. And, you do need to be fair. And I asked her at one point if she thinks she's in denial, because she cannot reconcile the father she knew with the monster he was. I think sometimes you do get surprised at how candid people can be when they know, this is on historical record now, because she died shortly after I filmed her. So this was her last and kind of really only extensive filmed interview.
Oh,
And the
wow.
meeting with her brother was also pretty, you know, because they hadn't ever really, since they were children, and never in depth at the time, talked about what had happened at Auschwitz. So it was kind of, in a way, quite a momentous occasion.
Yes, absolutely. I thought it was interesting too. Their descriptions of Auschwitz were actually very shocking to hear. It was they called it like idyllic and beautiful, and they loved it there. And I thought that was,
Yeah.
you know, I don't know. I found that interesting. You know, we hear descriptions of Auschwitz and you don't hear those words. So very interesting.
It's very true what you're saying, because actually when I first spoke to both of them, I walked away with the impression that Auschwitz was probably the place they had been happiest in. And having been in my first TV job, I made a film in Auschwitz and I thought it was the bleakest place on earth. So it's really hard to get your head round what they're actually talking about. Of course, you know, to be fair to them, they talk of life on the other side of the wall in the Commandant's villa. But, you know, there was a crematorium literally 190 yards from their house. So in a way, it's very interesting, I think, how children react to kind of traumatic events in the past, because I think it must have been traumatic to see and feel kind of that something was wrong, even if you don't know exactly, you didn't know what. And also the way they left, you know, because obviously they left Auschwitz before the Red Army came, and they went to somewhere near Berlin, which they had to leave in a real hurry because the Red Army was approaching very quickly. So you kind of think it's a different perspective, the child's perspective, I think.
Well, and to speak on the child's perspective, there's an incredibly important Bible verse that's invoked in this movie by Kai Haas, the grandson of Rudolf Haas. And it's the sins of our father are to be laid upon the children. Then there's also, it made me think of the Jewish saying that Jewish people have, which is Lador Bador, from generation to generation. And I just think it's an interesting dichotomy between the two. And there's this idea of Jewish people asking their grandparents where they were during World War II. But in this case, it's different. It's what's their responsibility do they hold the responsibility of their grandparents? And then there's the generational trauma to go along with that. And, you know, do you think that there's a responsibility? When people watch this film, what should they come out of it feeling or thinking? Not that you should dictate what they're feeling, but, you know, what's the ultimate message, I guess, from the film, from these two dichotomies of generations?
Yeah, well, I think ultimately, I think the Holocaust didn't end when the camps were liberated. You know, the repercussions went down the generations, the children and even grandchildren. So I think ultimately the fact that almost 80 years later, Anita, the survivor, has it in her to invite Hans-Jürgen, the son of the perpetrator of the hell, as she describes it, of Auschwitz. You know, that's a really positive message. And it shows that, you know, we have to talk. And especially, you know, in a world riddled with conflict, I think one of the messages of the film is that, you know, dialogue is important. I mean, conflicts tend to be resolved when people come together. So I think it's symbolically, you know, a message of hope, really, for the future.
And that moment in the film where they meet is honestly an amazing moment. That's another thing that I've not seen before when learning about the Holocaust. And she even says this is a truly historic moment. What was it like being in the room filming with them when they were meeting?
It was extraordinary because she invited them into her home, so where she was sitting, you know, surrounded by pictures of her dead, some of them killed in the Holocaust, her parents. And you sort of think, I mean, it was so powerful because, you know, it was something that I think Hans-Jürgen in particular, and also Kai, who feels he's burdened with hereditary sin, you know, it was something that they didn't really expect. I mean, in a way, if they'd met at Auschwitz or a memorial, it would have been less powerful. It was this act of kind of welcoming them into her space and her life, which I think really stayed with them. Of course, Hans-Jürgen had never met anyone who had been at Auschwitz. I mean, certainly not Birkenau, which was where the final solution, you know, the mass killing of the Jews took place. So I think he was really nervous, you know, in the taxi. He was kind of a bit shaky at the time.
And do you do anything to make him less nervous, or are you merely just an observer of what's going on?
Well, on that occasion, yes, because I think, you know, I wasn't there to interfere. I mean, once this meeting had been set up, it was all about, you know, letting it develop. In the same way, we didn't interfere when Hans-Jürgen met his sister for the first time, because that was pretty weird when they both reverted to some childhood game they played at Auschwitz, you know. So I told the crew, we're just going to step back and follow the action, but I'm not going to interfere at all. So I think, you know, that's how you capture authenticity, because otherwise it all becomes a bit staged.
In terms of your process making the film, I'm just curious, what were your biggest challenges with this?
Well, I think for every filmmaker, the biggest challenge is how are you going to get this film financed? So for 3 years, I did it pretty much in my sort of non-existent spare time. So I used to work on this in the evening, weekends, holidays. It dictated where I went. I mean, at the time, one of my children was still at primary school. So, you know, it was a whole operation where we'd go on holiday somewhere so I could do some filming. So I would say the biggest challenge was the financing, and the access to some extent, because Hans-Jürgen, of course, had never engaged with his family past. I would say he had very actively avoided doing so, even though maybe he wasn't aware of it. So, you know, it was to convince his son Kai to let me meet him and then talk to him about why I thought it wasn't important that he took part in this film, which would tell a story that a few years down the line could no longer be told, you know, because he's in his late 80s. Can I also say, actually, when you say about the challenges, because that's the other thing, you know, once the film is finished, you have to get it out there. So, you know, we were really lucky that Warner Brothers and HBO took it on, that Fathom is doing these screenings, because actually it means that this film will reach its audience. I mean, I've been in documentary for a long time, and very often, you know, it's so difficult. People make brilliant films, but the world is saturated with content. And, you know, I think on really important subjects, they deserve a proper chance to be seen and for the message to be heard.
There's one film that came out last year, yes, called The Zone of Interest. And that was the fictional portrayal of Rudolf Haas and his family. Can you explain maybe a little bit about the timeline? Had you seen Zone of Interest before making the film? Was it a coincidence that these two are happening? The films are coming out right around the same time?
It was a coincidence that that my documentary was in production at the same time as the fiction film. I was aware a film was being made based on Martin Amis's novel, which I'd read. And when I was in Auschwitz, I knew that they had been filming nearby, but you know, it was a fiction film, and I'd read the book. I mean, the book covers 1943, 1944, and it's a very, I mean, it's a sort of fictionalized portrayal, based on some facts. So in a way, I mean, I thought it's interesting because I also think people should talk more about the Holocaust, you know, in a way. For young people especially, it seems so far in the past, you know, I mean, the people we filmed are the last people who have a direct, in a way, relationship with it. Once they're gone, it will all be newsreel and old testimony. So yeah, it was interesting because actually then I sort of forgot about it. It wasn't really relevant at the time to what I was doing. And then, yeah, the film came out, and that obviously made our documentary also kind of gave it maybe more relevance because suddenly we've got the real story of this fiction film.
This is something we ask everybody, and you know, if it's not in tone with the interview, that's okay. What's your favorite movie theater experience?
Well, when I was much younger, when I was a student, I used to go to all-night shows in a very arty cinema in London, where you'd go there at sort of midnight and watch 3 films, usually somehow thematically linked, but you'd basically watch them back to back. I mean, I wouldn't have the energy or the time, you know, these quite like sleep. But actually looking back, you know, that was really fun because often they were films, art house films, European or Eastern European, you know, things you wouldn't normally get. So it was very well curated. I would say that was really good fun.
Yes, I've been to a few film festivals, and it's similar in that way. But I love it. So where can people watch your film?
So our film is being released by Fathom, 2 special screenings on the 29th and 30th of May. And I think on their website, you can find the nearest cinema to you. It's, I think, more than 700 cinemas across the US.
Great. Awesome. Thank you so much, Daniela. I really appreciate your time.